I'm Ari Gordon. I'm the Director of Muslim-Jewish Relations at American Jewish Committee. It's an honor to be moderating this session on Christian-Muslim relations. And I want to take a moment and express gratitude to our partners and hosts at Georgetown University, the President's Office, the Berkeley Center, the Department of Theology, the Center for Jewish Civilization. Special thanks to Sam Wagner and Dr. John Borelli for their partnership. And more broadly, we heard from some of those incredible officers of the church in this work. And we know it does not happen on its own without archbishops like Bishop Machado and Pache and some of the others, all the interreligious officers that we see here. And so if you would join me for a moment for the dedication, institutional dedication to this work at a time where there are so many skeptics within each of our communities, I think that would be most appropriate.
May I just say, Ari's going to introduce speakers who have written books. Ari has recently published Sacred Orientation in Late Antiquity and Early Islam, 2025.
Thank you. I do have some books, the hard copies for our panelists I'll hold up for the Reading Rainbow part of this session. But yes, you're welcome to take a look at my own coming out later this year. I want to start with a classic joke, at least in our Jewish circles, on interfaith relations. It has to do with the priest, imam, and rabbi at their panel. And after the Christian and Muslim representative get up, the Jew gets up and says, "It's wonderful to be here with you, my neighbors in faith. Between the three of us, we represent half of the world's population." Right, and it's funny because even if we were not there, that would be the case. Jews are a tiny, tiny fragment of the global population, and there is no question that the nature of the relationship between Christians and Muslims in this world is of consequence to us all. And so it behooves all of us, whether that is our identity and community or not, to be invested in these questions, both in the opportunities as well as some of the challenges, whether those are theological around issues of the nature of Christ, crucifixion, the Trinity, other theological issues, or the social issues, the questions of Muslim minorities living in Christian majority countries and Christian minorities in Muslim majority countries, a history of conflicts, geopolitical and otherwise. And we should note that it was not Nostra Aetate that was the beginning of good stories to tell. Of course, these go back to the Prophet Muhammad hosting Christian delegations and even allowing them to pray in his mosque, facing their prayer direction east rather than south. A little plug for my book there on the Qibla. Or exchanges of letters between caliphs like Abdul Rahman and the emperor of Constantinople, right on through Mughal emperors in conversations with Jesuits, and on and on. And these touch points, they shouldn't be forgotten, but there is no question that Nostra Aetate started a new revolution. And before we start the session, I think it's worth reading the one small paragraph about Muslims. I know our speakers will refer to it, but not everyone, if not everyone has read Nostra Aetate in its entirety, it's certainly true, not everyone is aware of this. The church regards with esteem also the Muslims. They adore the one God who is the living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to humans. They strive to submit wholeheartedly, even to his inscrutable decrees, just as Abraham, with whom the faith of Islam is gladly linked, submitted to God. Though they do not acknowledge Jesus as God, they revere him as a prophet. They also honor Mary, his virgin mother. At times, they even call on her with devotion. Moreover, they look forward to the day of judgment when God will reward all those raised up. For this reason, they value the moral life and worship God, especially through prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. In the course of centuries, there have indeed arisen not a few quarrels and hostilities between Christians and Muslims, but now this sacred synod pleads with all to forget the past, to make sincere efforts for mutual understanding, and so to work together for the preservation and fostering of social justice, moral welfare, and peace and freedom for all humankind. And from that time, we'll hear about papal statements and visits and declarations that have brought actualization to this hope. And we are blessed to have some wonderful scholars and practitioners in the field that we'll hear from today on the topic. Dr. Pim Valkenburg specializes in the study of Islam and dialogue among Abrahamic religions. Born in the Netherlands, he studied theology and religious studies at Utrecht Catholic Theological University, and has been active for years. He held the title Ordinary Professor of Religion and Culture and Director of the Institute for Interreligious Study and Dialogue at Catholic University, and you'll see from his remarks he is anything but ordinary. And you should take a look at his book, Nostra Aetate, celebrating 50 years of the Catholic Church's dialogue with Jews and Muslims. 10 years later, there is so much in here that is still relevant. We'll then hear from Professor Yunus Mirza, the founding director of the Barzinji Institute for Global Virtual Learning at Shenandoah University. His research on the relationship between the Bible and Quran and the shared stories between them is incredibly stimulating. I've followed him for some years through the Quranic Studies Association and others. And his recently published book, The Islamic Mary, Maryam Through the Centuries, is another piece of what we'll be discussing today. And of course, the Reverend Dr. Susan Eastman, who's an associate research professor emerita of New Testament at Duke Divinity School. And she, like Yunus, has been involved in the Building Bridges seminar started by the Archbishop of Canterbury, now hosted here at Georgetown. And we're blessed with its coordinator, Sam Wagner, in the room today. And her very recently published commentary and interpretation of Romans is something we'd recommend as well. Without further ado, we'll go to the panel. We're going to hear short statements from the seats from each of our panelists, have a little bit of conversation between the three of us, and then get your questions ready because we want to be in conversation with you. Please join me for now in thanking the panelists in advance. Please.
Thank you very much. I also brought a little booklet or journal. It's Concilium, the journal number 4 from 2020. And the title of it is Signs of Hope in Muslim-Christian Relations. I brought it because I think this is what we are looking for today. I'm involved in a number of Christian-Muslim dialogues. I'm also involved in some Christian-Jewish dialogue and some Christian-Hindu dialogue. So I kind of sometimes try to compare, and you will hear about it a bit later. But I'm very aware that both in Christian-Jewish and Christian-Muslim dialogue, there have been crises here, specifically in the United States, where certainly our Muslim partners felt left alone by the Catholics because they were not able to come up with statements that Muslims would find help them in the situation of the people of Gaza. And I want to mention this because I think that is important to bear in mind in the overall picture of interreligious dialogue. So we discussed, I would get us started with kind of an overall picture because I think it is hard to talk about Catholic-Muslim dialogue or Christian-Muslim dialogue in general, so I think we should at least take into account that there are 3 levels of dialogue. There's the, let's say, the world church, and of course what the popes do, which is what we have been talking about much yesterday, and will probably be talking about in some of the discussion as well. Then there is the national level. I will be talking about that a bit more because I'm involved in it. Together with 2 other people in the rooms here, Jordan sitting there, and Father Alexei sitting there. We had a meeting last week here in Washington, D.C. It happened to be at Catholic University of America. I was no longer involved in the organization of that, which was good, because 10 years ago, we did the Nostra Aetate conference at Catholic University of America together with Rabbi Marantz and the American Jewish Congress, and also Muslim organizations. So there was kind of a tripartite organization which would probably no longer be possible now. That's the situation where we are now. So that's a national level, and then there's the local level. Now, you might have noticed that Zeynep Sayilgan would have been here on the panel. She is ill, she cannot come. I had trusted on her to talk a bit more about that local level. I live in Baltimore. ICGS, the Institute of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, does a lot of good work. Rumi Forum here in Washington, D.C. also does a lot of good work. But I will be mainly talking about this national level because that's the level that maybe most people are not so familiar with. And it's also because we had this meeting last week that we could just keep stock of where we are in Catholic-Muslim dialogue right now. So I want to kind of use the title that John Borelli has given us about opportunities and challenges to see, in my opinion, where we are on Catholic-Muslim dialogue. What I do think is one of the most important elements of every form of dialogue is forming friendships. And they're not just friendships as private friendships, even though it is great to see so many Hindu friends, Muslim friends, Jewish friends, Catholic friends here, but what Pope Francis called social friendships. That means friendships that make a difference in the larger world and that come together because they realize we're not in this for our personal warmth and friendship, but we're in this for the world and to try to make a better world together and see how we can do that. So I would say that is something that every dialogue tries to do, and the National Catholic Muslim Dialogue, and of course I should say started by John Borelli some 35 years ago, well maybe a little less, but still long ago, has formed a lot of long-standing friendships. These are important because the time has learned us that when something happens, people need to find one another to kind of diffuse a possible problem, if it's there, a possible violence. So that is important, but again, it's not only friendship for the personal matter, but for the larger society. I think what the National Catholic Muslim Dialogue has started to do better than they did in the past is to reach out to society and to discuss societal topics that are important. So this year we have been working on environmental justice, on Laudato Si compared to the Muslim document Al-Mizan, and which is very fruitful. And I know the younger generation, my own children for instance, find this hugely important. And the bottles here, we discuss plastic bottles. Mm-hmm. So if you have a Muslim organization or at Georgetown, they all deal with the same problems and they try to come up with very similar answers to these. So I think this is where we are making progress. Then I come to the challenges, and that's the last thing I will say for now. I think there's two real challenges before us. One of them is a better understanding of theological disagreements. I think that is where the Building Bridges dialogue does much better, but you will be talking about that. Let me give you one small example. John Borelli talked a bit about the originators of that Nostra Aetate text, which basically is a text formed by Robert Caspar, a missionary of Africa, and George Anawati. So I'm writing in my retirement a book about George Anawati. Last year I was in Cairo at the Institut Dominicain d'Études Orientales, where he was formed. And so the little example I want to give is, he gave in 1978 a talk at Al-Azhar University, or he was supposed to give a talk. This was when Anwar Sadat did his policy of rapprochement with Israel. As you know, he went to Jerusalem and he tried, and you may also know that most Arab countries did not like that at all. So he tried to find some support in Western society. So he went to Pope Paul VI at an audience, and he tried to find support from the Pope. Interestingly, if you find the notes, the Pope told him, I agree with you, but please don't forget the Palestinians, which is interesting, 1978. But then Sadat invited the Pope back to Egypt. So the Pope came, and Sadat asked Al-Azhar University, can you please organize a dialogue event with these Catholics coming from Europe? Okay, they did that, they organized that. Anawati would give a talk with the title, A Common Faith Between Christians and Muslims. Foi commune, or Imam Mutasharraq, what's it? Mutasharraq, yeah. So the idea would be that Anawati would present this idea, Christians and Muslims have a common faith. But the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar didn't like it, so he was not allowed to give that talk. And then later on, there was in the Majallat, the journal of Al-Azhar, a very critical reprisal by a Muslim scholar who basically said, well, this is how Christians try to missionize us, try to lure us into dialogue, but in fact, they want to make us Christians. So there was a very nasty, if you want, if you know Anawati, that was not at all what they wanted, but that was how it was received. Okay, the point that I'm trying to make is this. If you do not know the history of Sadat going with his, going to seek support in the West, the Arab countries not liking it, and the whole history of colonialism between France and Egypt behind it, you don't understand what was happening. So you don't understand why Al-Azhar at that moment didn't want to talk about a common faith between Christians and Muslims. Now, Nostra Aetate clearly says Muslims and Christians worship, adore the one true God. And in Lumen Gentium, even together with us, they worship the one God. And I would say this is the one theological point that Nostra Aetate made that is really something that we cannot go back to. So if there are organizations like Wheaton College, for instance, where you will be fired if you say exactly that, we need to talk among Christians about that. Now, my point is here, we have not learned how to do that. I think in Christian-Jewish dialogue, we have learned how to, let's say, how to specify the way we look at each other. In Christian-Muslim dialogue, we have not yet learned to do that. So I think that's a big challenge forward for us. And then the last point I want to make, and this more or less goes back to the Hindu dialogue that we just discussed with Archbishop Machado and with Anuttama Dasa, namely, I think we are not good, generally speaking, there are exceptions, in sharing with one another the motives from which we do our work. So our religious motivation. The Catholic term is communicatio in sacris. So how do you share with one another the spiritual motives from which you do your work? I think we have not made much progress there, and I think that our friendship can only become a social friendship that really changes something in the world if we learn more as Hindus and Christians. And I've been part of the Vaishnava tradition dialogue as well, and I've felt that, how they are able to do that much more. So that's one of the challenges for Catholic-Muslim dialogue. That's what I want to say.
So thanks so much for the organizers for inviting me and having me come back to Georgetown. Georgetown has a close place in my heart. I have all my degrees from Georgetown, and it actually exposed me to Christian-Muslim dialogue. It's here where I took Problem of God, and I also took Intro to Biblical Literature, as well as benefiting from the Center for Christian Muslim Understanding. So it's really an honor to be back, and it's motivated my research and my teaching, especially the idea of men and women for each other, as well as educating the whole person. So to build off what Pim mentioned, this idea of the history of Nostra Aetate, I want to build upon that and talk about how it's relevant today for Muslims and Muslim Christian and Jewish dialogue. So the first thing when I read it today in the contemporary period, you see that there is this element of seeing Muslims as shared. And there's the idea of friendship, that they share certain values to us. So we live in a contemporary period where it's mixed, and oftentimes we see a rise of Islamophobia as well as anti-Semitism. And part of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia is the idea that these people are different than us. They are from another place, they originate, they have a different culture, different religious texts, their values are alien to us. And when you read Nostra Aetate, which is over 60 years ago, you see that there is this emphasis on similarities, that the emphasis on Jesus, even though mentioning there's a difference in interpretation, that of Abraham, than that of Mary. And this particular line really inspired me as I began to become interested and involved with Christian-Muslim dialogue, the emphasis on Mary and Christianity. And it made me ask the question and explore, how do Muslims understand Mary? And that led to my new book. So on top of that, you see there's this recognizing that Muslims are spiritual beings. They're not just political beings. They're not people simply to undermine Western civilization. It mentions this idea that they pray, right? That they give almsgiving, zakah, and they also fast. They engage in Sawm, or in the month of Ramadan, as well as outside of the blessed month. So you see that Nostra Aetate is recognizing and speaking, I think, not explicitly, but to this idea of friendship, that Muslims, they share certain figures with us, they are also spiritual beings, they pray, they fast, they try to help the poor. And then maybe to speak to Pim's point here, is that there is, this last line I think is really crucial, is that the idea of social justice, moral welfare, peace and freedom for all of humankind. And that's the actual end of Nostra Aetate. So it's not just recognizing Muslims as people who share certain figures, but there is this emphasis that we want to build a better world together. And that better world is going to focus on social justice, moral welfare, peace, and freedom. So I think to build off Pim's last point about the challenges or the opportunities of Nostra Aetate, it's to really ask ourselves, how can Christians and Muslims, as well as Jews, build that better world? And you mentioned already, Gaza has been in the mind, of course, for many Muslims. I know I see people in the room here that can speak more eloquently, more articulate than me on that issue. So how in this moment, where we have discussed already the Holy Land, the crisis there, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, as well as the hunger issue, how can we as people of different faiths contribute to a better understanding of a more just world? And I think another opportunity is, how can we build upon Nostra Aetate? So Nostra Aetate, Ari, you read it, I think it was just 1 or 2 minutes. And it's just really 2 paragraphs on Christian-Muslim relations. So we are now 60 years later. I think the seeds are there, but what can we do beyond that? And I think part of my work is to explore Mary in Christianity and Islam. There could be a lot of work on Abraham as well as Jesus, but then also building projects between Christian and Muslims that are built on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, such as zero hunger, climate change, as well as social equity and gender equality. So, thanks so much.
So I got involved in Muslim-Christian dialogue starting in 2008, when I was invited out of the blue to contribute my work as a New Testament scholar to a conference in Rome of building bridges, which Eunice and I have both been part of, which was started by the Archbishop of Canterbury and Tony Blair, actually, right after 9/11. The first meeting was at Lambeth, I think, in 2002. And then when Rowan Williams became Archbishop of Canterbury, he was very involved in building bridges for the 10 years of his tenure. And then when he stepped down, then Georgetown picked it up and has graciously kept it going for the past 10 plus years, more than that. So that's that. And so I found myself in this really interesting conversation that was given to me more than. My background is that I'm an Episcopal priest and a New Testament scholar, so I'm not Catholic. And the way Building Bridges works is that it brings together Christians from different traditions and Muslims from different traditions. So it's a very complicated conversation. And what that means is that there are a variety of Christian views in the room and a variety of Muslim views in the room as we discuss one topic, whatever the topic is for that year's meeting. And we meet every year, once a year, for a very intense week. And so it strikes me that that complexity really is important, because what it does is show that there's not one Christian view and there's not one Muslim view. And in the conversations that we're having, we're airing our differences in front of each other. And that requires an element of trust and of relationship, that Muslims see Christians disagreeing with each other and Christians see Muslims disagreeing with each other. And sometimes those are the hardest disagreements going on. Sometimes that's where the tensions really lie. And as we engage that together, we learn on a deep level the complex, rich traditions and gifts of each of our faith communities, as opposed to a shallow kind of, oh yeah, we think the same kind of thing. No, we don't even think the same among Christians, and we certainly don't think the same between Christians and Muslims. But the watchword of these meetings was really articulated by Rowan Williams and became sort of a mantra. Our goal is to improve the quality of our differences. Every Building Bridges participant probably can quote that. Our goal is to improve the quality of our differences. So up front is a care to not gloss over difference, but to clarify in a spirit of mutual respect and affection and interest. And I think that really contributes to deep conversations and respect, just that very simple idea. I think that in terms of Nostra Aetate, which I never heard mentioned, but maybe another, Jane, you're here, you've been involved in earlier ones, it was mentioned at some time. I never heard it explicitly mentioned in Building Bridges. I know that it stood behind and contributed to an Anglican document that we discussed in 2008 called A Generous Word on Interfaith Dialogue. And I think it's important to note that at that meeting, my first one, we also discussed a Muslim document, A Common Word Between Us, also really a plea for interfaith communication and partnerships. So I would say that Nostra Aetate was not in the foreground of any of this. However, I would say that the spirit of Nostra Aetate is displayed, and the issues, the goals and the issues that come up with Nostra Aetate, I can trace in Building Bridges in my experience there. And the first is what's been mentioned in all through our conferences today and yesterday, and that's friendship. And friendship is the thing that I so immensely valued, the friendship across difference. And that's just creating the foundation upon which difficult conversations can take place. And I would say another aspect of that, and I think this comes in and it speaks to some of what you've been saying, Pim, is that we are there as scholar believers. And that's quite clear. The Muslims are there and they are all practitioners of their faith, and there's always a prayer room for the Muslims. And Christians always have Eucharist every morning. And there's one or two Muslims who sometimes come to the Eucharist, not to partake, but just to share. And in one memorable meeting, which was in Doha, the topic was prayer. And in our small groups, we shared quite frankly with each other about our experiences of prayer, how we practice prayer, how tensions around that. And we also, the Muslims hosted a prayer session that Christians were invited to, and the Christians hosted a prayer that Muslims were invited to. But there's always the sense that we are there as those for whom this faith is existentially central to the core of our being. And so we get the honor and privilege of seeing one another's faces as they face towards God, so to speak. So I think that creates a kind of humility and a context and a deepening for friendship that is really crucial for the conversations that take place. I would say that Nostra Aetate, I'm going to try to be brief here, not to go on too much. Nostra Aetate, as was noted, I think quite rightly in the second panel yesterday, raises issues as well as opportunities. And Ruth Langer, who I don't see here, I think raised a very important question. She said that, she also talked about friendship very importantly, but she said, you know, there are theological issues that are raised here and still not addressed. And she said, for example, the claim that Jesus is the Savior of all, and the claim that God's covenant with Israel is eternal. How do those go together? And I think that I think that's right, that the conversation sharpens issues, not only of where we agree, but of where we differ within our faith traditions and between each other. And that, to me, is really valuable because our goal is not to agree on everything. Our goal is to understand one another better and form friendships and partnerships in the context of honoring the differences as well. And I think I have experienced that in building bridges in depth. And it really creates what is true friendship, which is we're honest with each other. You know, we don't pretend. A question that remains, and it has been named many times here, so I'm just going to highlight, I won't go on it. So who is this for? Who's doing this? Who is this for? Nostra Aetate, that's a question for Nostra Aetate. I mean, this can be a very in-house kind of conversation. Who's doing this? Who is it for? What difference does this make to the great majority of people in the world? And this is a question that comes up in the Building Bridges conversations as well. You know, how does this affect the great majority of folks who have never heard of any of this, don't read books, and have their own firmly established opinions? How do we reach that? I think that's an ongoing issue. I think there are ways of thinking about that, and people here are doing that, but I just want to name that again. And finally, Nostra Aetate ends with this plea to put our past behind. And my question is that possible or desirable? And I think the past keeps coming back. And so I think finding our ways forward is, I think there are different ways to think about this in terms of how we reckon with the past. Who's past? Who's telling that past? What narrative about the past? All of that always is affecting conversations as we go forward. That's what I was saying.
So we'll have a chance for a little discussion here, but as I said, please be ready with questions for when we get there. We will sit in silence if you don't have something to say. No, we'll come back, but please do ask questions. And thank you, Susan. I want to start with the who is it for question, because we can look at that long history of the statements, visits, the symbolic gestures, the photo opportunities that came after Nostra Aetate, whether it's St. Pope John Paul II in Turkey or Morocco. We're speaking about Muslim communities to the bishops of the Philippines, Pope Benedict to the Muslim community in Berlin or Jordan. Of course, many are aware of Pope Francis's document on human fraternity with the Sheikh of Al-Azhar that has led to actually physical buildings, church, synagogue, and mosque in one site. Pope Francis' last visit to Jakarta to the Grand Imam, hosted by the Grand Imam Nasaruddin Umar at Istiqlal Mosque, a mosque that is attached physically by what they call the Tolerance Tunnel to the cathedral. The Imam is a friend of AJC's, studied Judaism and interreligious relations with us for 6 weeks at a fellowship in 2024. All of these touch points are things that we can point to, but the who is it for is a question for each of you, whether it's a work of scholarship or a papal statement or a physical structure that exists only on one point on the planet. how are you, or how do you encourage this room and others watching to put this out there into communities? It is beautiful as an act of witness, but I think we're all doing this, as you said, for the work that it does in the world. How do we do that?
I think one of the ways to tackle that question is, again, to distinguish between different sorts of dialogue and their goals. So I would say, let me again give the dialogues that I'm involved in as an example. So the National Catholic Muslim Dialogue is clearly meant to produce results that the bishops on the one hand, and then the Muslim organizations like ISNA and ICNA on the other hand can use for their constituencies to give them some information. For instance, they recently published, and again I mentioned Jordan here, a document on Islamophobia, specifically for the Catholic bishops to put on their website, which they have done, and to just spread the word among the bishops, and then through the bishops, through the people in the pew, as they say. Now, of course, we don't have the illusion that all Catholics now know about that. So that's an entirely different thing. But I think our task is to get this document out. And then it is the task of the bishops to further promulgate it. I would say it's a different way as I see it. For instance, in another dialogue, I haven't mentioned that one, we call it Scholars in Dialogue. It's a small group of 12 to 14 Catholic and Muslim scholars that comes together twice a year. And I'm doing this together with Dr. Zeki Saritoprak of John Carroll University. And we try to bring together a group of theologians who discuss their stuff. They don't have any goal other than the joy of sharing, disagreeing, trying to find one another. It's kind of I sometimes think of it as a kind of a mini building bridges. And the goal is just to further communication among ourselves, and hopefully our students will pick it up. So I think that is what we as scholars are meant to do, is to inspire our students. And I know for sure there are some who are really wanting to work on in this field.
So that's great. I heard creation and distribution of resources, and having scholars and those who are at the table see themselves as touch points of communication and as models. What else? What else would you recommend?
I like that point about creation and distribution. And a lot of times, this is building off what Susan said, that us as academics, we often produce that peer-reviewed article or the edited volume, and that's beautiful, but what's next, right? How do we actually speak to a medium that's accessible? Well, how can we turn certain conversations into a podcast or a video or a webinar? I see AJS is doing a great job, AGC, with the videos and the booklets and the brochures and so forth. So this is an example of, you have a great product, but how can you market it, or how can you present it in ways that are accessible to everyday people? And then I just want to reiterate this idea of projects, because I think, yes, the academic work is important, yes, the teaching, the education, but also have students engage in project-based learning. So at Shenandoah University, one thing that we've done is to partner with universities in the Middle East, for example, Yarmouk University in Jordan, and we look at issues that have global impact, such as zero hunger. So we had a delegation go to Jordan, to Yarmouk, explore the local food banks. They came and visited us. They learned how we are dealing with food banks. Then we did a survey. What do the clientele actually need in those food banks? And we learned that the folks in Yarmouk and in Jordan, they need more protein, while the folks in the United States need more fruits and vegetables. So they actually went on, our Yarmouk counterparts and colleagues published a paper on their results, and it influenced the Jordanian government. And then some members of our team actually went forward, and they started a food bank on our campus. So now students can actually go grab food if they need it to fight against food insecurity. So I think that's the idea of not just educating, but how do we work together on common projects that have a larger global appeal and speak to what Nostra Aetate mentioned in terms of social justice, moral welfare, peace and freedom for all humanity.
So the new media, what would Nostra Aetate look like as a TikTok video? It would be one way to think about it. And then also trust building through action, bringing more people in because the action may be their seat at the table, not necessarily the theological conversation. Yeah, thank you. Susan, anything to add?
I would say something a little bit surprising here. It's also for the participants, and that seems a bit odd, but certainly in my experience with building bridges, it has people sometimes from Malaysia or Indonesia or India or all over the US or, well, a lot of places, Egypt, Africa, Turkey. This is varied with the global climate as things shift. But many people say that in their context, this gathering strengthens them and encourages them and gives them what they need to go back into their context and continue working for good relationships. Not every, and that is important too. So there is, I'm just going to name that as well because I've seen that. Yeah.
That there's renewal and support for those who often may feel lonely or
Pretty
alone.
isolated
And
situations.
when one AJC board member said this to me, I'm sitting in my treehouse and flashing a flashlight, and it's good to know that my friend in his treehouse is flashing one back,
Yeah.
and I get to go back and feel that I'm not
That's nice.
alone. Yeah.
That's nice.
So I wanna talk about something challenging, which is the skeptics in our community, but I'll do it by way of also acknowledging what a couple have, which is the challenges in our world today, conflicts that divide, whether that's in India and Africa, or of course in the Holy Land. And I think it bears saying that no one who's involved in this space wants to see starvation, loss of homes, killings of any innocents. We want to see Palestinians return to their homes, to live, to survive, to begin to start to heal. We want to see Israelis welcome their loved ones back and feel in security, feel that they live in security, and the rights of all peoples to dignity, safety, self-determination, and life to be honored. And I hope that there's a world where we see that, and I think we believe and know that our work contributes to it. And I think it's true probably of all the communities that the failings in that conflict and in other spaces leads to great skepticism about interfaith work, about bridge building in whatever term we would. How do you speak to the skeptics in your communities? How do you recommend people speak to the skeptics in their communities who say, nice talk, but what does that do?
I was at a conference in Poland last fall of Jews and Christians on the topic of peace in Jerusalem. And one of the participants, a Jewish woman who does interfaith work, she said, we always talk about how Christians say the Messiah has come and Jews say the Messiah hasn't yet come. But the fact is we're all waiting. So how can we wait well together? Which I thought was quite wise. And it strikes me, I talk about hope as a horizon and a direction. And hope, this comes from the New Testament. Hope, who hopes for what you see? You hope for what you don't see. You learn to wait for it with patient endurance. And so I think that the direction of what you're hoping for, even though you don't see it, shapes what you do in the present. Some people hope for peace based on the annihilation of the enemy. That is actually the way the world tends to operate. You'll get peace when you get rid of the enemy. And that, even though that they may not see that, that shapes the direction they're going and their actions in the present. So what we hope for from this, in this interfaith conversation that we're having, is empowers, shapes a line of direction in the present, but also knowing that we don't see that has to create the space to name, and this is what's so important with dealing with cynicism. not starry-eyed hope, but naming the real, seemingly humanly intractable problems at the same time. So having a bifocal vision where you're naming the present conflicts, but yet having this really faith-based hope for a future that is not of destruction, but is of mutual welcome. So I talk in terms of hope and waiting and how that changes the present and creates room to name the failures and the conflicts at the same time.
Yeah, I would say within the Muslim community, there is this skepticism towards interfaith dialogue, interreligious understanding, because there is this sense that this dialogue is political. There is this effort to co-opt someone into a certain political agenda. There's also this sense that there is a preconceived understanding of where the dialogue should go, and that Muslims just need to kind of get in line. So I think to respond to that we have to be genuine in that dialogue, that we participate in the dialogue and see where it will go, and realize it has to be organic, that people are coming, they open up, they're honest about their different opinions, but something new could develop, new projects, new ideas, new programs. And I think also to respond to the idea of skepticism is the follow-through. So I think there's so many beautiful conferences, events, programs, and people have great discussions, but they don't see what's next. Nothing really changed, right? So I think making it clear and evident that we did this program, we had this discussion, and this is what came out of it, and these are the action items.
Really appreciate that.
Can I add a word? I once started out as a peace activist back in the Netherlands. I still don't understand who admitted me to this country because I was against the cruise missiles at that time. But the frustration in that peace activist group was only when there is some form of violence involved, the media got interested. So what I learned there was not to hope for a short-term solution. And I think in interreligious dialogue, that is very important to learn the lessons from history, which also teaches you that sometimes things like I would say the first 30 years after Nostra Aetate, it went up. And then after 2000, it has been mentioned, I think Archbishop Machado mentioned that. After 2000, well, at best you can say there was consolidation, but probably it's kind of going down. And I do remember talking about skeptics at my own university, Catholic University of America. At a certain moment, students came and said, we don't want to hear about Judaism and Islam because that's all woke. It has nothing to do with Catholic teaching. Now, and that's a form of skepticism that is different, but it's very real right now. So I would say the only solution I know for that is, well, first of all, not expect that I can change the world. But second, and this is Thomas Aquinas, I'm a scholar of Thomas Aquinas, let's go and see what text we can agree on, and let's read these texts. So let's read Nostra Aetate, because it's not woke, it's church teaching.
And so in both of the cases of Eunice, what you said, and Pim, what you said, there may be this preconception of what the space is and sort of resisting getting it caught up into broader either culture wars or preconceptions so that individuals are allowed to explore and find their way within it. And on that, so we talked a little bit about the communal, we talked a little bit about the global. I want to ask you, I guess for my last question before we get to the audience, about the personal. What is something that you've been in this space, because each of you said scholar believers, and that you're coming with your full self to the table. What is something that you've seen as you've been in this Christian-Muslim dialogue that either surprised you, enriched your own understanding of your own faith, or that stands out for this room to know?
I'll tell a story. I was at a conference in Sarajevo, and then we had, some of us at least got to do a field trip, and which included going to Medjugorje, which is a famous site where Mary appeared to 3 teenage girls decades ago, and there's apparently is still appearing to these now elderly women. So it's a real pilgrimage site for Catholics, and it's huge. It's up on a plateau. We arrived there, and there's a huge church And people come from all over the world to Medjugorje. Some of you may have been there, I don't know. So most of the Muslims went off to get ice cream, which seemed eminently sensible to me. But I was cynical. I and my fellow Christians, we were feeling a little cynical about it. It's pretty, yeah, commercialized, it seemed. But we went into the church, and there were people prostrated on the floor and people praying in the pews, and we prayed and stuff, and then came out. And then one of the Muslim participants came running out from the church, and he came up to me and he said, "Do you know Italian?" I said, "Not really." He said, "Oh, okay." And he ran back into the church. And then he came out again and he said, "How's your French?" I said, "I can do French." So we went in, and we found this Franciscan monk who spoke French, and my friend said, "Can you ask him to give me a blessing? Tell him I want a blessing." So I said, I translated, and then he said, "Tell him I'm not Christian, I'm a Muslim." So I translated, and then ask him how I can pass it on. So then the monks told him to say, "Peace be with you, but don't make the sign of the cross because you're not a Muslim. You're not a Christian." And then pretty soon this young monk, he had his hand on my head and he was giving me a blessing. And I thought to myself, we all came out chastened, the Christians, the cynical Christians. I thought it was my Muslim friend who made me get a blessing in Medjugorje. Mm-hmm. And it's just sort of a lovely story, but it also illustrates to me how my experience is that my faith gets sharpened and deepened in encountering Muslims who venerate Jesus, not in the way I do, but still they challenge and strengthen and clarify my faith.
Even in a very tangible,
In
experiential
this very tangible
way. That's
way.
wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's a beautiful story.
It was
And
great.
to build off that, maybe we can continue the Mary theme is,
Yeah.
I think several years ago I was invited to be a respondent. Actually, Pim invited me, and there was an event on Rita George Tiverich's book, Christian, Muslims, and Mary. And I remember going to that event as a respondent. I had just written my book on the Bible and Quran, and thinking to myself, wow, this scholar, she's written an entire book on Mary and in relationship between Christianity and Islam. And that she personally values that relationship as a Catholic scholar, as a human being, as someone who has gone to Europe, has actually some roots in Bosnia and Yugoslavia. And she is someone that is expressing that, and she wants Christians and Muslims to respond to it. And I remember discussing there, being in really awe and inspired by her passion, her use of art, her way of dialoguing with people. And then I wrote a review of that book, and I thought to myself, well, maybe I should write a book to respond, or in many ways kind of continue that legacy of Mary between Christianity and Islam, which also is building upon Nostra Aetate in many ways, since Mary's name is mentioned. So I think in my education here at Georgetown, and then through my interreligious dialogue and interfaith work, there's so many people of other faiths who have really inspired me, and they have been sources of friendship and mentors to me and can sustain my work.
And so even your scholarship, which is dialogic in that sense and responsive. Mm.
I have 1 minute, I noticed. So let me tell a short story. It is from this Scholars in Dialogue group. We had a presentation by Christian Crocus, by the way, who has written a book about Christian de Chergier, his spiritual writings. And he gave a presentation about the way in which Christian de Chergier interacted with Muslims. There were two Muslims in the room. One Muslim was kind of questioning him and saying, well, did he, I have to do very short, did he feel guilty because of his colonialist French influence there in Algeria at that time? And then another Muslim came and said, you don't understand what this is about. It is not about guilt for colonialism. It is about guilt knowing as a Trappist monk, which Christian de Chargé was, that praying to God, you realize that you never get to the level of involvement with God and your fellow human beings that you should have. So it's not about colonialism, but much deeper, it's about human sinfulness. Now, hearing that from a Muslim, and he is a Muslim working at the Jesuit institution, but still, from a Muslim, made a very deep influence on me. And I think, oh, wow. He has got a way of reading Christian de Chargé that I have not yet reached.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful, all three. We have some time for questions and answers. Before I call on anyone in particular, let me just see how many we have in the room. Okay, I see a few. And are we prioritizing students, John? Yes. All right, do we have Georgetown students here? Please. Okay, so let's go 1, 2, 3. Please. And please introduce yourself so the room knows who you are.
Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan Denary Duffner. I've been a longtime student and staff member here at Georgetown. No longer a student, but thank you for letting me have an early question. I want to first thank Pim and all of you for delving into some of the history behind Nostra Aetate. There's a really wonderful article out by the Jesuit priest Father David Neuhaus who digs into some of that history, and I think it's in La Civiltà Cattolica, which I highly recommend on some of that history and how it actually relates to Israel-Palestine and our situation today. But I have more of a spiritual kind of question. Nostra Aetate talks about how we can look for the true and holy in other religions, and obviously mentions a lot of things in Islam that the church wants to praise. But I'm curious what each of you would add. Like if you were to add something true and holy from Islam that could be a part of Nostra Aetate 2.0, what would you as a Catholic, a Muslim, and an Anglican want to put in Nostra Aetate 2.0?
Okay, and let's take all three so that you can choose, although this one was directed to all three. Thank you, Jordan. Please.
Thank you. My name is Halil. I'm in the PhD program here at Georgetown. And
So they can all see you.
yes, that's also a question for all of you, and including you, the moderator. And it goes into the direction what you have already asked with the skeptics in our own communities, but also like just checking in where specifically Christian, Muslim, Jewish dialogue right now is, as like participants maybe, you know, as Jews or as Muslims, or also as observers from Christian participants in this dialogue as well. Thank
Question
you.
is, where
is
are
it?
we? What's the state of affairs?
Exactly, thank you.
Thank
And
you.
Muslim Jewish, particularly, is that correct?
And I think we have in front.
Let Jane go next. You had a question, right? Did I see a hand? Yes. Yes. Let Jane go next.
I'll be very brief. Jane McAuliffe, and I'm just going to take advantage of the fact that I might be among the older people in this room to ask if it would be fair to say that while acknowledging the skepticism, one must also acknowledge the enormous progress of normalization that we have seen since the 1960s. I was in college and studying theology when Nostra Aetate came out, and it felt revolutionary to our college theologians. I've participated in Muslim-Christian dialogue at the national level, at the Vatican, with building bridges, all of my life. And it doesn't, when I talk to people now, they're not asking, what's that? Why are you doing it? They may express disappointment, but there's also a sense of, oh yeah, that's what we do now. That's what we as people of goodwill, wanting to build a better world, we talk to people of other religions. So I'm asking, is that also a fair response to the skeptics?
I'm going to pause for three, but because we know that our host and master, Dr. John Borelli, has more, we're going to have to be disciplined and keep our responses to 1.5 minutes or 2. So the three questions are, what would you add to Nostra Aetate? What's the state of affairs today in the dialogue, including the trilateral perspective? And shouldn't we pause, and what's our reflection on the progress that's been made? And appreciate that perspective as well. And anyone can jump in first. This has been a remarkably polite and cooperative panel.
Okay, I'll try in 1 minute again. and I start with Jane's question. Yes, you're right, of course. So much has changed. So the best example for me is when I started out in Nijmegen doing interreligious dialogue, I could not find Muslims who were willing to do that because Muslims in Northwestern Europe were not brought to the country as in America as more or less intellectuals, but they were blue-collar workers, so no one was interested. And then the Turkish people of the Hizmet movement started being intellectually interested. So I have my relation. So, and I think that was a huge upswing in possibilities for dialogue in Northwestern Europe, but also in the United States. And it was started this time by Fethullah Gulen, so by Muslim persons. My one experience that's still with me is experience with my shoes. I was in Turkey in a mosque, and I had rather old shoes. And there was a furniture salesman in Izmir, in fact, and he saw my shoes, and after we came back from the mosque, he brought me a brand new pair of shoes. And he said, "Can I please accept your shoes as a gift to the Hizmet movement, and then in exchange for that, give you this pair of shoes in thankfulness for what you're doing for the Hizmet?" And I did not feel for one moment that he basically said, "Your shoes are dirty, you should have," but he said, no, this is your gift, and let me give a gift. So I call that meeting Christ in Turkey, talking
Honoring
about
you.
holiness.
Beautiful, beautiful story.
I think so. In terms of the question about Nosratate 2.0, I think Daniel Madigan actually has a very good article about Nosratate and what is it leaves out. And he mentions the idea of the Quran is absent and the Prophet Muhammad. So I think in the next iteration, hopefully maybe Jordan, you'll help draft that next iteration, Nosratate, there will be some discussion of those two items which were central for Muslim belief and understanding. So in terms of the trilateral, it's been stagnant. You know, Ari, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that. The Abrahamic, I think after 9/11, there was a large push for Abrahamic dialogue, Abrahamic understanding, Abrahamic religions. I haven't heard as much recently on that, and there's been more focus on Christian-Muslim dialogue and other Muslim Hindu as well as Muslim Buddhist, but Muslim-Jewish dialogue has not been on the forefront, I think, of a lot of Muslim communities' minds. And then I think, you know, moving forward with this idea of what Jane mentioned, I think I grew up, I'm a little bit younger than Pim, so I grew up in probably a generation where it was normalized. So I went to Georgetown, I studied here in the early 2000s, and then later graduated, and it was normalized to have Christian-Muslim dialogue. And part of going back to your community and say you participated in this, you weren't questioned, there was no criticism, it was encouraged. Also Muslim-Jewish dialogue, especially after 9/11, saw a lot of momentum and acceptance. So I think for me, and I think for my kids and my students, I see that this is part of how we do education.
You've said a lot. I don't need to add much. I would say the same thing about the Quran and Revelation for Nostra Aetate. And I might emphasize the notion of surrender to God. It does say submit wholeheartedly, but that I think is really crucial. And I think you're absolutely right, Jane. It's normalized because I see locally, on the local level, it's not unusual for, not just on the national level, but on the local level, for people to visit, for there to be interaction. I have a question, but I'm going to defer to John.
What's that?
I have a question for you, but
For me? Well, I'm the moderator, please. But I'll respond to the question just briefly with a word that I think I don't have the long memory that you do, Dr. McAuliffe or Dr. Borelli, and can recognize how much progress there's been. But if I look at the last 20 years, or from 9/11, which is, we shouldn't be marking way stations by terrible events, but let's say the few years after, and the narrative of a clash of civilizations we saw this flourishing of the response in human connection, whether that was Christian, Muslim, trilateral, Muslim, Jewish, 20 years of unprecedented building in this country, and that was true on the local level for local dialogues, for national and international conversations, and even just the appreciation of religion as a strategic vector in global discussions started entering the conversation for the US and Europe in ways that were obvious in other parts of the world for a long time, and of course were well known to the church. Pausing now at a moment of challenge and crisis, probably part of the reason why it feels like challenge and crisis is because of the trajectory that came before. And it's an incredibly helpful reminder of where we are, because the work that we need to do now has to be preparation for a trajectory that is not exactly the same as from this moment, but goes forward. And something I see in the various communities that I'm in discussion with, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and otherwise, is whether or not the voices are all at the same volume, those voices are all there. The connective tissue of trust is still there. Some people have distanced, for some it's withered, but by and large, there's this intercommunal connection that exists. And our challenge, our discussion is, in this moment, what do we do with that? How do we respond? We don't get to choose the epoch that we live in. This is the one we're in. What do we do? I know we probably have time for just the one question and the wrap.
Thank you. Thank you. I would have had God consciousness, that Nostra Aetate 3 could say, Muslims look for God consciousness in others. I had that experience when I was gathered with another number of Muslims talking about an upcoming event during the visit of John Paul to the United States. And they were watching it on TV live in Baltimore. And one of them said, he truly is a holy man. And it just came clear. No matter your faith, that's probably why pilgrimage sites in India of Hindu saints had Muslim visitors at one point. But anyway, skepticism. I look for responses to Nostra Aetate. And we all know that a common word between us and you grew out of a speech that Benedict XVI gave in Regensburg. But 30 days after that speech, a number of Muslim scholars of a variety of legal traditions issued a response that was critical but yet constructive in offering what might be said and quoting Pope John Paul II. I said, where did this come from? These people don't often never have spoken together. Called Yvonne Haddad in the Islamic Center here, and she said, don't you know about the Amman process? No, King of Jordan had gathered legal scholars because this was the time we had fatwas issued that terrorism was good and all of this, and they wanted to take on who is authorized to issue a fatwa and what may a fatwa cover and so forth. And they were debating this when the speech was made. So a year later, they expanded that effort and issued a common word. Will that kind of thing happen? Do you see any indications? I know Pope Francis was significant in these agreements in Indonesia and with Ahmed Al-Tayeb of Al-Azhar, but do you see any of this in the future?
I love that leaning towards the future, whether it's declarations or not, 1 minute each, if not less, on what is that snapshot for the future? What is it we're working towards, that hopeful vision that is also realistic?
What will be a very big challenge in my mind is whether we can get the talk about Abraham and the Abrahamic religions back from the politicized version in which it is now, not the least from the American government and their Abraham Accords. So that went in a direction that I think does not help. So can we wrestle that back to a more spiritual, God-centered way? And that's also where I see the possible solution to the question of the one faith, because Nostra Aetate talks about that exactly.
I'm really happy you mentioned the common word, because many people say that's the Islamic Nostra Aetate. And in many ways, Nostra Aetate, as discussed throughout this conference, is a response to World War II, to the Holocaust, and then, as you nicely articulated, The Common Word is a response to Pope Benedict, the Iraq War, 9/11. So I'm hopeful that we don't have to wait for another crisis to emerge, and that we can do consistent events and programs such as this one, such as building bridges, and hopefully come up with a Nostra Aetate 8.2 or a common word that's organic rather than reactionary.
I guess the question would be whether it's possible to come up with a jointly produced such statement. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But that would be amazing. Yeah.
So before we go to applause and thanking our panelists, let's see it as an act of commitment to doing what, Eunice, you lifted up for us from Nostra Aetate, that we work together for the preservation and fostering of social justice, moral welfare, peace and freedom for all humankind. This was an incredibly rich discussion and got us started on a conversation that will take us well into the future. Thank you.